Hello and welcome back to the Trinity Student Managed Fund podcast with me, Emanuele Roncalli di Montorio-Veronese, where I speak with leaders in the world of business, finance and technology to give our students a better insight into the careers we may wish to pursue. Today, I sit down and speak with Mr. Joseph Baratta, who is the Global Head of Private Equity at Blackstone and a member of Blackstone's Board of Directors. He is also a member of the firm's Management Committee and serves on many of the firm's investment committees. Mr. Baratta joined Blackstone in 1998, and in 2001 he moved to London to help establish Blackstone's corporate private equity business in Europe. Since 2012, Mr. Baratta has served as the firm's global head of private equity and is located in New York. Mr. Baratta has served on the boards of many past Blackstone portfolio companies and currently serves as a member or observer on the boards of Ancestry, Candle Media, First Eagle Investment Management, Medline, Merlin Entertainments Group, and Copeland. He is also a former member of the Board of Trustees of Georgetown University, is a trustee of the Tate Foundation, and serves on the board of Year Up, an organization focused on youth employment. Before joining Blackstone, Mr. Baratta was with Tinicum Incorporated and McKern D. Liu and Company. Mr. Baratta also worked at Morgan Stanley in its mergers and acquisitions department. Mr. Baratta graduated magna cum laude from Georgetown University. I really hope you enjoy this insightful conversation with Mr. Joseph Baratta. So, Mr. Joe Baratta, welcome to the Trinity Student Managed Fund podcast.
Thank you for having me. Happy to be here with you.
Thank you so much for taking the time. And obviously, first and foremost, congratulations on your promotion.
Oh, thank you.
To Global Head of Private Equity Strategies.
Thank you.
So I'd love to jump straight into it. Could you bring our listeners back to your university days at Georgetown? You majored in finance and minored in government. Could you kind of tell us what was your thought process at the time? What were your aspirations? And your view?
Well, I'll go even half a step back to high school and what I was thinking and why I went to Georgetown in the first place. I was very politically active, and I thought, maybe I would pursue a career in politics or the government. And in the back of my mind, you don't know much about business as a high schooler, but my father was an entrepreneur. He owned a small business. He had 3 health clubs in Sacramento and a few in the Central Valley of California. And I thought, I'd also like to learn about business. And Georgetown was kind of well positioned as a university with strong roots in political science, the School of Foreign Service, but also with a undergraduate business school. So I applied and I got in. I applied to the undergraduate business school at Georgetown. You have to apply to one of the 4 schools. And so I was accepted into the business school. And when I got there, I wanted to take as many courses as I could in political science, American government, in the School of Foreign Service, because I wasn't exactly sure what I wanted to do. So you can't double major outside of the school you're in. So I took a minor in government, which is a strong subject area at Georgetown.
And you spoke about in the commencement speech the Georgetown factor. Maybe for our Dublin Trinity College listeners that aren't familiar, could you kind of talk about what is the Georgetown factor and why that was so important to you?
Yeah. Georgetown is a Jesuit institution, sort of imbues the curriculum with a sense of social responsibility and ethics and morality without being overly trying to convert people to Catholicism. But it definitely, your education is underpinned with a duty to other people and to society at large, and to act ethically. Part of the core curriculum at Georgetown, you have an ethics course. As a business school student, you have a school called Business Ethics. You take a course called The Problem of God, which understands which explores the sort of philosophical and historical underpinnings of why is there a God? Why did humanity think about a God in the first place? And so what I think is unique about an education at Georgetown is that you are given all of these things. And I do think for the most part, the students live that after they graduate. There's always an eye to, am I doing the right thing? You feel an obligation to community service and to engaging philanthropic organizations and not just being completely self-interested. So that's those are all parts of the Georgetown factor.
So very broad, you'd say, education as well.
Yeah. But I think unlike maybe some of the secular schools, underpinned with a strong grounding in ethics and morality and service to others.
Right. And I'd love to look at, kind of early on in your career. Maybe we started, Morgan Stanley, but, feel free, the other places you worked. So kind of how did that influence your, I guess, investment approach now, but also your career generally? I mean, what are kind of the lessons you learned in those early days, investment banking and so forth?
Yeah. Well, back then there were no real university internships on Wall Street. I mean, it was very, very rare. And so I had no real experience in investment banking. I think the summer between my junior and senior years, I literally worked at a local branch of the Dean Witter stock brokerage in Washington, D.C., cold calling people about buying, stocks and bonds, literally. And so I didn't learn much about investment banking doing that, but I did learn a lot about doing, what's asked of you, however painful it may be. I engaged in the standard on-campus interview process with investment banks. I got turned down at several places, but I got a job at Morgan Stanley in the M&A group, and started there in July of 1993 after I graduated. And so I did the 2-year investment banking analyst thing. It was an amazing experience. Some of my cube mates in a room like this size, there were 4 of us. One of them was Orlando Bravo, who went on, of course, to basically found Thoma Bravo and really identify software buyouts as like a thing that could scale. He's an amazing guy. So the point is, this was like formative years. I built a network, I built a skill set, worked extremely hard, harder than I thought was possible, challenged myself, but decided I didn't want to be an advisor. I didn't want to be an investment banker. And at the time, private equity was a sort of, I'd say, an emerging career for younger people. It wasn't, and it was nowhere near as prestigious as staying at Morgan Stanley or Goldman Sachs and building a career as an investment banker. But I viewed it as a way to learn how to invest and how to be a better business person, actually engaging with a company and helping the CEO make that company better and make important strategic and operating decisions. It sort of harkens back to why I was interested in business in the first place, with my dad being an entrepreneur, actually running a business. This was, as close as you can get from being a financier to actually engaging with the business and learning to become a business person. So private equity was very interesting to me. It was the early days, really, of the industry. I mean, it had been around for a long time, but it had not scaled. You had a few firms like KKR, Bain Capital. I worked for, at the time, a good growing middle market private equity firm called McCowan DeLue, which doesn't exist anymore. But there I really learned what the industry was about, how to invest in private equity. And then ultimately I ended up as a young associate at Blackstone in 1998. So I had a couple of jobs from my investment banking tenure at Morgan Stanley until when I ended up at Blackstone. But once I got to Blackstone, I said, geez, these are really smart people who know exactly what they're doing. And the firm had, I felt like, the opportunity to really keep growing and to become possibly a leader in the industry. And that was a good bet in 1998. So 27 years later, here we are. And we're the largest alternative asset manager in the world. So, I bet right. That's part of like a career. You get lucky to some degree, but you put yourself in the right industry that's growing, that affords those kind of entrepreneurial opportunities.
And kind of just going back, because you mentioned one of the early jobs as well was kind of the stock, cold.
Yeah, that was my internship between my junior and senior year in college. Yeah.
Did you ever, did you ever consider, maybe public markets? No, I obviously, and as well, this is one around when, the rise of hedge funds was happening, but did you ever kind of consider that public market career path?
I did. That was the other sort of emerging path for these young professionals that had been trained at investment banks. Hedge funds were just beginning to become an asset class. themselves and hiring young analysts from these investment banking programs. The issue I had with public markets is I'm a fundamental investor. I believe that a company its valuation is dependent on how much cash flow it generates over a long period of time, and all of that. The problem is the markets at any moment in time don't actually reflect fundamental value. And if you start at the wrong time in the public markets in your career and you don't do so well, not because you're not good at it, but because the markets just fall over, or you're allocated to the wrong industry, it's a lot more career volatility. And so, and you don't, in my opinion, I don't think you really learn how a business operates, and you're not engaging with management teams and engaging on the boards of companies. You're sort of just reading, consuming research, reading 10Ks, doing kind of outside in 360 diligence, but you're not actually able to help affect change in these companies. And so it didn't scratch the itch that I had to learn to be a business person instead of a financial analyst, instead of just a financial analyst. So there was like career volatility. You could be right in the long run, but wrong in the short run, and that affects your career, and you don't really learn to be a business person. So those are all the reasons I didn't choose the hedge fund path.
Valid point. Well, it makes sense. And I suppose, you mentioned there during your time at Morgan Stanley, you've worked with so many great investors. You've mentioned Tony James, Steve Schwartzman, obviously John Gray as well. I'd love to know like your early mentors as well, or who have been significant mentors during your career, and perhaps what are some of the key pieces of advice they've given you?
Well, the mentors I've had have been, I think, really transformational in my career over the years, and most of them I'm still close personal friends with and see regularly. So at Morgan Stanley, I worked for two or three people: George Boutros, who now is probably the most prominent tech M&A banker at a firm called Catalyst. Paul Taubman, who was a young partner, and he became to run investment banking at Morgan Stanley and started his own firm, which actually took Blackstone's advisory business, merged it with a business he was starting, and it's now called PJT Partners. So Paul Taubman would have been an early mentor. I'm having lunch with him next week. And then in private equity, the person who hired me at McCown DeLue, Charlie Ayers, and helped me along my career as I was moving firms, is still a close personal friend. Eric Ruttenberg, who runs a family business, which is a family investment organization that I worked for right before I started at Blackstone, really taught me how to be an investor. We've made investments with him and his family and his firm. We're still close friends. So those people have helped me along my career, both professionally and personally, and I'm still very close to them. So I think, if you invest in relationships over long periods of time, they really pay dividends both professionally and personally.
And in terms of like, if you had to pick maybe one piece of advice or one maybe story from out of those names.
And I think also I failed to mention, Steve Schwarzman and Tony James while I've been at Blackstone, but I'm still at Blackstone. So and Tony's not here, but I'd say Tony was very influential in my career, taught me how really to be a great private equity investor. He gave me the opportunity to manage the global private equity business 12 years ago in 2012, taught me how you manage complicated, very motivated professionals, who are working with you and for you. I think, in trying to pinpoint one element of advice, I think Tony sort of taught me that you should worry about the problems that you actually have, not the problems that you think you might have. Because it turns out those things don't always come to pass. So when you have a problem and you have to deal with it, and you have to anticipate it. But sometimes you think you're going to have all kinds of other problems, which you end up not having. So why waste your time thinking about it? It's a little bit like worry about what you can control, which is something that my dad always said. Like, worry about what you can control, not what you can't. And that's been a very important thing. And I think, Tony sort of gave that to me, and like, deal with the problems you know you have, not the ones you think you might have.
Very stoic philosophy.
Yes.
Marcus Aurelius.
Yes, exactly. There was some real wisdom in the Stoics, yes.
And I suppose, you mentioned that, Morgan Stanley in the cubicle, you worked with Orlando Bravo.
Yeah.
I heard in one of your interviews, you were interviewed by Todd Fisher, of course, now from KKR.
Yes.
I'd love to know, you've met and worked alongside it with some of the greatest investors in the world. I'm wondering, kind of, what lessons have you learned from them in terms of, like, how has that impacted your investment approach, and kind of what do you think differentiates them? Are there any kind of traits amongst them which you've noticed?
Well, investing is a very humbling endeavor, because if you do it long enough, you will make mistakes, and there will be a moment when you're wrong about something. And the most important thing as an investor, and I've learned from many of those people you mentioned, the best private equity investors, are constantly asking themselves, like, what's challenging, like, their views of the world and what works and what doesn't work. And the environment is constantly changing, and there was conventional wisdom in private equity for decades that you can't really invest in the technology sector because it's hard to predict, moves very quickly. Businesses don't tend to generate a lot of cash flows. And it took sort of entrepreneurial people like Orlando Bravo and Robert Smith at Vista and my friends at Silver Lake, Egon Durbin, also a Georgetown grad, to really question that wisdom and say, well, no, wait, you can be a private investor in a fast-moving, dynamic sector that's maybe not as predictable. And they built very large firms to invest in the technology sector. From a buyout perspective, not venture capital. So later stage, more mature, but higher growth companies. And that was, something that, a lot of the traditional firms, Blackstone and KKR and others, missed for a while. And so I think you have to constantly question the received wisdom in the market. And you have to really be humble and know just because you've been successful for a long period of time doesn't mean that you will continue to be if you keep doing the exact same thing, because the world is dynamic and changes.
And also, would you say having a contrarian view based on that, or?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it pays to be contrarian, but sometimes certain industries that are out of favor for good reason. So traditional bricks and mortar retail and traditional linear broadcast media. I mean, those maybe 10 years ago, people were saying, oh, these are cheap. We should be investing in linear TV stations and regional sports networks and satellite broadcast companies. And actually they were completely dislocated by broadband internet to everybody's phone and home that allowed you to consume things directly instead of through this sort of linear channel. So there are, I think there's something about mean reversion. Valuations tend to revert to means over time. If you believed interest rates were going to be zero forever, which a lot of people did, it was contrarian, and I was one of them who thought, sitting there in 2018, 19, 20, that the 10-year treasury can't be 1% forever, and that you can't have 0% cost of capital, and that PE multiples were probably unsustainably high and would come down. I think mean reversion is powerful, and when you see these, things get way out of whack with historical norms, that's a good time to be a contrarian. I think being a contrarian just because something's cheap can be dangerous, though.
Right, it's cheap for a reason, right?
There's a lot of things that are cheap for a reason.
And not to go too off script, but you mentioned that sort of your view changed. How do you kind of develop your worldview, and how does that change, especially, taking into account kind of your philosophy of being humble as an investor? I mean, how often, say, would you like reevaluate your view and so forth?
Well, I think what's happened in private equity is that the market has gotten much more participation. So there are many more funds, much more capital. It's better intermediated by the banks. So auction processes, there's more financing available. All the way back in the 90s, we used to have to go to banks to pitch them on financing that we wanted for our company. So that was part of my job as an associate at a private equity firm, even at Blackstone in the early days, was to build the model, go to the banks, basically write the presentation for the banks on, here's why you should finance this company. Now it's, of course, the other way around, and the financing is highly competitive, and there's lots of it, particularly in bull markets. Virtually anybody can get access. And that's forced us to think about, okay, it's no longer an inefficient market where you can buy something at 6 times EBITDA and sell it in the public markets at 8. That's gone. So what are we going to do to adapt? And what we've done in the flagship private equity business is to focus on bigger, better, higher quality businesses that aren't going to be dislocated by the significant innovations in technology, where we can still add value to the companies operationally, but where we're buying just much better businesses, and businesses that are operating in industries that have some degree of secular growth, rather than saying, well, we can buy it cheaply, we can harvest cash flows, we can cut costs, we can put a structure on it that protects us. Like, they're just industries that, as we were talking about earlier, that just, they're cheap for a reason. They are on the wrong side of technology, and they're probably not going to exist in 10, 15 years.
Right.
At worst. And at best, you're unlikely to be able to sell them efficiently to somebody else because they've got significant headwinds. So we've sort of evolved our private equity model to buy better quality, larger businesses. We have the benefit of scale. We've got large capital that we can deploy in single transactions. We've got a great reputation with larger public companies in doing corporate carve-outs, and with large families in buying family-owned companies. And so I think we're differentiated on size, on scale, on reputation, on ability to deal with transaction complexity. But we want to do that for the highest quality businesses we can find.
I'd love to come back to this idea of high quality businesses and kind of your investment approach. But could we shift our focus to the Blackstone career pathways? Because I know this is something you're very passionate about, and something, I'd love to know, what inspired you to help launch this program?
Well, I think part of the narrative earlier about the sort of the Jesuit ethos of being men and women for others and social responsibility, I've always in the back of my mind, thought, if I'm going to do something outside of like my career philanthropically and with my time, I want it to be focused on people who haven't had the same opportunities as I have as a result of their socioeconomic status, their race, the fact that they had a bump on the linear journey. We talk about my pathway and the one that you're on. You come from a reasonable family, you get a good education, you go to a reasonable college, you work hard, you get a good job, but sometimes something happens along the way, something unforeseen. A parent gets ill, you get in trouble for something, you're young. And once you get derailed, it's very hard to get back onto that progression. And so I was involved when I moved back from London in 2012. I got involved with a group called Year Up, which is an organization that finds these people who've been derailed for one reason or another, or haven't had access to opportunity, gives them a year of training, hard job skills, and also soft skills, like how do you show up at the office every day? How do you dress? What do you say? and then hard skills to actually be able to contribute, and then gets them internships at big firms in sort of middle skill jobs. So JP Morgan, Bank of America, in sort of compliance, in middle office, and at large technology companies. And I saw how transformational that year of training, and then the opportunity to work at a large firm. And if you looked at the conversion of these internships to full-time jobs of the year up graduates, it was very high. And once they've converted to full-time jobs, now these are people who went from only being able to really get minimum wage jobs at fast food restaurants or manual labor to career sustaining jobs where they can raise families, buy a house. And it fundamentally changes their lives. And I said, wow, that's really powerful. And then as I sort of, my job evolved at Blackstone, and I said, geez, we should be able to do this across our portfolio companies, give people who our companies aren't currently accessing at least a shot to interview and to be in the recruiting process for career sustaining kind of, entry-level management type jobs at our portfolio companies. And we worked with Year Up to help us design sort of a program that our companies can adopt to know, what do they need to change? They have to change their recruiting practices. Often they have to change their degree requirements. Why do you need a 4-year degree to do certain roles? And give access to these people who've been opportunity challenged historically. So our career pathways program, now we have 65 companies participating in it across the Blackstone portfolio. And our portfolio companies have hired 10,500 people from historically untapped talent communities. And so that's the long story of where it came from. And we'll continue to do that. Hopefully we'll roll this out across, almost all of our control investments, largely in the United States. And I do think, the issue, particularly in the US, is not a skills issue, it's an opportunity issue.
Would you say it's more of an issue in the US or Europe?
Well, it's definitely an issue in the US, and I think it's also likely an issue in Europe too. We've just been focused on the US because that's where we have the bulk of our portfolio and where these organizations are set up to really address this issue. My guess is Europe is somewhere behind the US in focusing on this opportunity divide.
Could we also talk now about the early days of private equity? You mentioned being an associate at Blackstone in the late 90s. Could you kind of give our listeners maybe an insight into what that was like? And yeah, I suppose also building European business, what were the challenges? And I suppose as complex as Europe is, all the different languages, the different currencies.
Well, I'll start with the Europe thing because that's closer in time anyway, in the chronology. I moved in November of 2001 to help start our private equity business in Europe with David Blitzer, who went on to start our tactical opportunities business. Great guy. And when we moved, the single currency was to be implemented in January of 2002. So it was quite early in the economic and monetary union of the Eurozone. And London had not yet truly been declared, sort of the capital of commerce, investment banking, deal doing, what have you, capital markets. But that's where we were in London. Of course, I didn't speak languages, nor did Blitzer, so that was sort of putting us at a disadvantage. But the private equity industry was still in its infancy in Europe. It was still called venture capital in large part. Permira was called Schroeder Ventures. Cinven hadn't long changed its name from, it used to be managing money for the coal mining union and other unions in Britain. And so, we were still early days. And my sort of insight, to the extent I had one, was that the private equity market in Europe, in terms of the types of deals that were being done, was at least a decade behind the United States. And I said, well, let's see if what worked in the US, might work in Europe, in particular in the UK, because language was easier, culturally more similar, and it was emerging as sort of the center of sort of activity, deal activity. And so we did a series of sort of buy and build transactions, things that had been rolled up in the United States, in the UK. So pubs and healthcare facilities and visitor attractions and theme parks. We did a similar thing in Germany with waste management businesses and packaging companies. And those all largely worked as capital markets got more liquidity, more capital was attracted to private equity, that market matured. The miracle of the economic union of those sort of 2002 to 2000 pre-financial crisis period, economies were growing very rapidly all over the Eurozone. The UK was the real beneficiary of lots of immigration, rising standards of living. So it was like a beautiful time to be there. And we just sort of did some of the things that worked in the US. We could buy pubs for, 6 and 7 times cash flow that still owned their real estate, which was an extraordinary thing. And then you could sell the real estate and end up with operating businesses. So there was lots of ways to make money. It was sort of an inefficient market. And that was a really fun time to be there. Now it's a lot more efficient, a lot more competitive. And of course, the Eurozone is not quite as growthy as it was back then. And there's some structural issues and other things. And then of course, Brexit. And so it's way more complex now than it was back then. And I just feel fortunate to have been there in that moment. And that really, another point on like, what would you attribute my success to? Part of it is like being in the right place at the right time, deciding private equity was a good industry, working at a great firm like Blackstone, taking this sort of risk earlier in my career. I was 29 or 30 years old when I moved to London, being in, the UK in particular, as the private equity market was taking off. So there is some like putting yourself in a position to benefit from good tailwinds, but you need the tailwinds. And so those are all part of, it's not just like I'm some crazy genius. It's like I've benefited from lots of macro tailwinds in the industry and Blackstone itself.
So then that leads me on to my question very nicely. If you had to turn back the clock now, you're 20, 21 years old, you've just graduated. If you could work in, any country, any industry, where would it be? I actually read an article, I think it was last year, it was Henry Kravis who said if he was like 30 years old again, he would go to Japan. If he could speak Japanese, that's where he would start his career. But I'd love to know, Joe Baratta, what is your...
Well, I certainly, Japan is, I agree with Henry in that Japan is a capital market that's reforming in the way that the Eurozone capital markets did in that kind of 2002-3 period, and large corporates becoming much more focused on shareholder value and return on employed capital, and there'll be lots of divestitures. That being said, Japan is a is a unique market. It doesn't grow that fast. It's sort of it has its limitations. I think the United States is the most amazing economy in the world, period. So I think I would still start my career in the United States. It's entrepreneurial. There's no more liquid capital market. There's no more entrepreneurial place. All the major innovations of the last, not all, but most of the major innovations in the post-war period have come largely out of the United States. And it's sort of an endless set of opportunities for young people. Now, I can't say exactly where I would position my career, because when I was 23, 4 years old working at an investment bank, I had the insight that, okay, the prestigious career, the lower risk career was to stay at Morgan Stanley and become a managing director and partner and build a great life. They said first class business in a first class way and all that stuff, which is great and was true. But the risk I took is that this other part of the capital markets and private equity could grow very substantially. I could learn, how to be an investor, how to be a business person, and all that was very exciting. And I said, "Oh, I'll take a risk if it doesn't work. I can always probably go back and try to be an investment banker." Now, I have a son who's 20 years old, and he goes to Georgetown. And my advice to him is like, do what is really exciting to you. Because you can't fake it in these jobs. It's like full blown commitment, and you have to love it and be willing to sacrifice for it. So whatever really turns your crank, you should pursue, and you should fully commit. But I think starting out, there's no better place, I think, in the world to start your career than the United States. I really believe that, even now.
Amen.
Yeah.
Well, you clearly have loved investing, especially at Blackstone. You've had an extraordinary investment career, very successful. Can we talk about your investment approach? And you talked about great businesses. Kind of in from your perspective, what makes a truly great business? What are the characteristics?
Yeah. Well, one thing we talk about a lot, and this is something that I really only started thinking about maybe 5 years ago, and I think it's a question that is relevant mostly for larger companies, but even smaller ones. How important is the company? If it went away tomorrow, would anybody care? Is it providing a service, a product that is essential to its customers that is hard to replace? Because if the answer to that is no, well, lots of people can do it. Then what do you have? You don't. What is the sustainable competitive advantage then? Now, in smaller companies, emerging growth, like, oh, well, they're creating a new and better way to do a thing, and a thing that everybody wants and needs. So, like, look at Netflix. Netflix in its early days, like, it didn't matter to anybody, like, DVD boxes or whatever, but they had a vision of, we are going to change the way people consume content. And there were a couple of enablers along the way. So if you're an innovative company, it's like you are doing something that people actually want and need, and you're doing it better, and you're positioned to take advantage of where the technological change is going. So I want to only buy businesses that are important or have the potential to be important to their customers.
Right, and critical infrastructure.
You have been listening to the Trinity SMF podcast. You can find more of this podcast on our website, www.trinitysmf.com, and follow us on our social media to find out more about the podcast releases, upcoming events, and much more. Thank you again for listening, and stay tuned.